We have a lot to discuss. Let's meet our panel here in our studio. Sourabh Gupta is a senior Asia-Pacific International Relations Policy Specialist. From Beijing, Victor Gao is the director of the China National Association of International Studies. Merrill Matthews is the resident scholar for the Institute for Policy Innovation. He joins us from Dallas, and also here in our studio, the president of the Global Policy Institute, Paolo Von Schirach. Welcome to all of you. Victor, let me start with you. So we heard both China and the United States very clearly lay out their interests and their priorities at this Shangri-La summit. We heard the U.S. Defense Secretary, James Mattis, who was at that summit, say that the Asia-Pacific is of vital importance to United States security and strategic interests. He says it remains a priority for the United States. Let's listen to some of what Mattis had to say.
Despite China's claims to the contrary, the placement of these weapon systems is tied directly to military use for the purposes of intimidation and coercion.
So James Mattis there, Victor, referring to the deployment by China of weapon systems in the South China Sea. What do you make of what he had to say?
Well, first of all, I think from the Chinese perspective, we find what Mad Dog Mattis said at the Shangri-La Forum in Singapore very provocative and very destructive and unconstructive for peace and stability in this region. The Chinese armament in the Chinese-owned territories in the South China Sea is in direct response to the provocation by the United States military, naval forces, as well as air forces in the South China Sea. And be assured, if the United States want to put more and more forces in the South China Sea to do the provocation, the Chinese military will continue to arm up these islands in self-defense. Therefore, the better way is to calm down and refrain from using the military means as a bluff against China. China is not to be bluffed, and the more pressure you put onto China, the more resilient it will become, and China will not kowtow to the United States military force. That's the simple fact.
So, Paolo, we heard what James Mattis, the U.S. Defense Secretary, had to say there at the summit. This is how China responded to that. Let's watch.
The garrison and deployment of weapons in the reefs and islands in the South China Sea are within the scope of China's sovereignty. Irresponsible talks by any other country are interference in China's internal affairs.
So, Paolo, are we seeing a continuation of what is basically very intense power rivalry here between the United States and China in this particular part of the world? Where do you see this going?
Well, here's the problem. There is in my view, a disconnect. Whatever Mr. Secretary Mattis said, the real problem is lack of means. The American naval presence in the region, in the Pacific, has shrunk significantly because our fleet has shrunk. Way back, in the Reagan administration, we were talking about a 600-ship Navy, okay? Now we're below 300. That's a fact. These are the facts of life. Whatever the secretary may say and whatever the policy aspirations may be, I just don't see America having the tools to implement this strategy. We have seen, a few years ago under President Obama, the pivot to Asia. Yeah. Interesting policy redirection, away from the European theater, old stuff, Cold War is over, let's move to where the action is, which is Asia. And that amounted to the deployment in northern Australia of a few hundred Marines. Well, that's not exactly a strategic transformation, of the deployment of the balance of forces in the region. So I take a slightly different look at all this. Whatever the Chinese position may be and the Chinese position regarding sovereignty over all these little islands and rocks in the South China Sea is well known, but it's also disputed. It's not like unanimously approved. Mm-hmm. But be that as it may, whatever the conflicting claims may be about sovereignty, the problem, as I see it, is that America no longer has the tools and the ability to enforce whatever policy design it may have, whereas China, as a growing power, being more prosperous and being able to devote more resources to its military and certainly to its blue water navy, has had a chance to assert itself more forcefully in its immediate neighborhood. And this is what's going on.
Okay, let me go to Merrill Matthews in Dallas. And Merrill, what is your view on what you're hearing here? I mean, very clearly, at least rhetorically, we've been hearing pushback from the United States and what is going on there, pushback against China. What do you make of it?
Well, I think that's right. Secretary Mattis was speaking to the conference, but the real audience was China, I believe, for his speech, as he highlighted several things. And he's trying to reassure some of the Asian and Pacific Rim nations that the U.S. is back in the game. As was pointed out, President Obama said we're going to have a pivot to Asia. He did not actually put many resources into that. The U.S. has already passed more money for the defensive buildup there. Plus, the U.S. Senate now has got bipartisan legislation addressing specifically this, which would put more money into the area, provide more arms for Taiwan, and try to provide more resources to try to build that, including giving the president the ability to be able to negotiate either bilateral or multilateral agreements with some of the countries there.
So, Merrill, are you saying that when the United States would give more money to Taiwan, is the United States outsourcing its security in the Asia-Pacific to other countries?
No, I don't think it is, but I think it's trying to make a statement that the U.S. wants to have a commitment there. The problem is, even though we know Secretary Mattis, this is important to him, it's important to the Senate, President Trump has really never weighed in on this. It's almost like it's not on his radar screen because you don't hear him talking about this particular issue.
So, Rob, we heard very clearly at that conference, India and the United States talk about the Indo-Pacific theater. That's a change from Asia-Pacific, isn't it? What's the significance of that?
It's significant, particularly for the, I would say, from the United States perspective, that we've had Pacific Command for such a long period of time, and now that's becoming the Indo-Pacific Command. Now it's missing the Asia in the middle out there, and that has become an area of great anxiety, if I may say, for countries like ASEAN. The U.S. has always been a little leery of having Asia in there just by itself. Asia-Pacific was fine. Now we have Indo-Pacific, which lacks the Asia out there. And the feeling is that Mr. Modi rebutted that in his speech, but the feeling is that we are trying to create exclusive clubs out here, which actually keeps the vast body of Asians outside that club. And that sort of a system is not going to be durable. So
yeah, but is it in some way an acknowledgement of India's security role in the region?
It is an acknowledgement of India's security role. India has been very forthright in talking about the Indo-Pacific. India was never part of the San Francisco hub and spoke system. It was outside it. It is entering the great game of the Asia-Pacific. And it wants to be in, and it talks about the Indo-Pacific very, very cheerfully. But the fact of the matter is that India was also very, very clear, not just in Modi's speech, but for the last decade or more than a decade, that Indo-Pacific concept is not at the expense of ASEAN or ASEAN centrality. That is not so clear when it comes to the Americans talking about this concept, because there's a lack of conviction when even Secretary Mattis talks about ASEAN being central to this. But when a question was frankly asked to him after his prepared remarks, so where does ASEAN fit into this? It was, there wasn't real elucidation of that point. It was just, again, formal speak from the Secretary. And so it's important that the Indo-Pacific region and the Asian region cannot be built on a sustainable basis without the Asians per se being its authors. And in a significant way, ASEAN and China having a significant role in that. And so it's still something up for grabs, and the definition itself is very varied among each of the countries in the Indo-Pacific which subscribe to the Indo-Pacific. So I would say at this point of time, it's still more of a geographical definition rather than a strategy.
Victor, the Defense Secretary, James Mattis, he also said that there would be consequences for China, given the role that China plays in the South China Sea. One of those consequences we've seen already, he pointed out, was the fact that invitation to China to take part in those RIMPAC exercises has now been withdrawn. How significant is that?
No, I don't think it means a lot. I think there are consequences for the continued incursion by the U.S. military into the South China Sea. The U.S. naval forces already incurred into the 12 nautical mile territorial sea of China around some of the islands in the South China Sea. This is very provocative. This is a recipe for disaster. This is a recipe for misjudgment. And if anything wrong happened involving the two military forces of China and the United States, the consequences will be dire for China as well as for the United States and the rest of the world. Therefore, the United States need to handle itself more prudently rather than keep provoking China. And the consequence of keep provoking China is China will pour more resources into armament and into defending itself, into arming all these islands and reefs and atolls in the South China Sea. Therefore, don't blame China for the militarization of some of these islands. Blame the United States' continued incursion into the Chinese territorial sea, into the Chinese South China Sea region, and into very provocative actions when they claim to be exercising the freedom of navigation. And don't be surprised if China will do the same thing, sailing its ships along the California coast or Virginia coast, not too far away into the future. And then, if that happens, don't blame China for being provocative, because China will be doing exactly what the United States has been doing in the South China Sea.
So, Merrill, here we have a situation where the United States talks of consequences for Chinese behavior. Again, if we look at it from the Chinese point of view, China protested a week ago because U.S. warships came within 12 nautical miles of its seashore islands. China saw that as grave provocation.
Well, right. The disinviting from RIMPAC, I think, is right. That's not a major consequence. What the U.S. interest here is making sure that the international sea lanes are open for trade. President Obama told us that he got assurances from the president that it was not going to be that China was not going to militarize these islands. The U.S. now believes that that is happening, and there's militarization going on in the islands. And so from the U.S. standpoint, it feels like this is a ratcheting up, and its interest is to make sure that those military forces aren't used to close down international sea lanes.
Very quickly, Victor, what is your response to that? The accusation that China is militarizing these islands and that international sea lanes, which are vital for international trade, are being threatened.
The international freedom of navigation for the ships, for example, in the South China Sea, is important to all the countries involved, but particularly it is important for China. China is the largest trading nation, and the bulk of the Chinese shipping business goes through the South China Sea. Therefore, I could say very fairly that no other country in the world cares about the freedom of navigation in the South China Sea as China does. And cite any example of obstruction of freedom of navigation in the South China Sea, either in the air or in the sea, by any country in recent memory. No, there is no such blockage or no such blockade or obstruction of freedom of navigation. What the United States is doing is using the name of freedom of navigation to misuse and abuse the freedom of navigation to exercise provocation against China by incursion into the Chinese territorial waters. And this must stop. Otherwise, consequences will happen. Maybe one of the ships will be shot down.
Okay, I want to move on to the other big story in Asia, and that is, Paolo, the upcoming summit between, well, we hope it'll happen, President Trump and the DPRK leader Kim Jong-un. It was on, then it was off, now it's on again. It started out with pretty big ambitions, especially from the American side. Now we are hearing that it's been downgraded to what's been referred to as a meet and greet encounter. Expectations have been lowered significantly, haven't they?
They have indeed, and again, in my judgment, I said this before, and I repeat it now, the notion that the objective, whatever defined by both sides, of denuclearization of the peninsula, and therefore the end of the North Korean nuclear program, is an aspiration on our side, on the American side, but not something that can be accomplished, certainly not in one meeting. It's crazy even to think about it. And so where I see things moving is that this becomes a meeting, perhaps an interesting meeting, a good meeting that sets an agenda, perhaps some kind of a roadmap that says, let's discuss all the various issues of peace in the peninsula, the reconciliation between the two Koreas, maybe eventually getting into something that looks like a road to a peace treaty and the end of the hostilities. Believe it or not, there's only an armistice between the two Koreas after, what, half a century of, since the Korean War. But the notion that America can obtain what it really wants, and what was in a very ill-advised way proclaimed by key advisors, by both National Security Advisor Bolton and Vice President Pence, that this is going to be the Libya option. That is, the whole thing packed in a couple of containers and shipped off to the United States. First of all, the North Korean nuclear program is a little bigger than the Libyan one. Well, and that option doesn't seem to, how can I say, arouse great happiness in Pyongyang, given also what happened to Gaddafi years later, even though this was unrelated to surrendering the nuclear program. But the fundamental fact is this. The only leverage that North Korea has in these negotiations is its nuclear arsenal. Right. Before they give that up entirely, they have to obtain, I don't know what. Again, I'm not quite sure what the end game of Mr. Kim is, but before they sign off on an agreement that says, okay, we're done with this thing, take it, verifiable, you can send everybody here, the International Atomic Energy Agency, whatever you want to send, we don't have anything anymore, all the nukes are gone. Before that happens, a lot of other things have to happen, because again, once they give that up, they've got nothing, literally nothing.
I mean, even if we see some kind of a treaty that guarantees the DPRK's security, that's not going to happen soon.
No. First of all, again, honestly, I don't want to be a pessimist, but I'm not sure under what circumstances is ever going to happen. In other words, the idea that we've set this thing in motion, that the leaders of the two Koreas came together, and this sort of magically transforms the atmosphere and the politics and the ideology and the hostility, and that indeed we can see that not only the end of nuclear weapons, but let's not forget there are thousands of artillery tubes from the north trained on Seoul today that even without using any nukes can lay to waste, the capital city of South Korea in a few hours, probably. Okay. So that's what's going on right now.
Sourabh, I think there is general agreement among analysts that expectations are very low for this meeting. There's not going to be the breakthrough that was announced a few weeks ago, the Big Bang breakthrough, as it was called at that time. So do you agree with Paolo that what this summit will essentially achieve is setting an agenda?
Yes, setting an agenda, but I think that will be not ambitious enough and not sufficient. In which case, the sort of capital that President Trump has invested in this is simply going to go down the tube. I don't think it'll be worth it. I still feel that they have to reach for something big, and that something big must be framed in at least a statement of principles with, yes, an action agenda which follows it. And what they have been discussing is fundamentally the basic elements of the bargain: complete, verifiable, irreversible denuclearization, and basically all weapons of mass destruction, and complete, verifiable, irreversible regime guarantee. And I know Kim wants that through a treaty in the U.S. Senate, so that a successor administration can't trash that down. I mean, we have to think on these broad and ambitious terms, have a broad statement of principles, and then, of course, how do you structure the mechanics of that will be a difficult call, but I assume we will be getting some insight on that front too at the summit. But I don't think just getting to know you getting to know you will be a failure, frankly.
Merrill, how complicated is this going to be? Because we've heard the DPRK say that they will be prepared to remove all their nuclear weapons, but the United States has to take its troops out of the demilitarized zone, the DMZ, and also withdraw its nuclear umbrella from Japan and South Korea. Can you see that happening?
I think it will be difficult, but if South Korea is willing to let those troops go, and there'll have to be negotiations with Japan about whether or not we want to pull out our forces from there. But if those parts of the country are willing to do something at least over a period of several years, then I think Donald Trump might be willing to go along with it. And who knows what Kim Jong-un will be willing to do, but it may be that he's ready for a turn. Right. I think the best you can be is cautiously optimistic here, but it's a big hurdle yet.
Victor, no doubt Beijing is watching these developments very closely. What are Chinese expectations on this summit?
Well, first of all, I think from Beijing's perspective, we welcome the imminent summit meeting between Mr. Kim and President Donald Trump of the United States. We believe dialogue is better than warmongering, and dialogue is better than threatening to use the force against DPRK. And hopefully, the summit meeting on June the 12th in Singapore will at least lay the groundwork for more work to be done, which will eventually lead to denuclearization. And denuclearization need to be coupled with guarantee for the survival of the political system, regime, safety, and the territorial integrity of DPRK as a country. And it will be very, very difficult to make sure that these two objectives can be balanced off against each other and be achieved within a foreseeable period of time. And I think one critical challenge we see is the mismatch of expectation. DPRK may have very, very different definition or understanding of denuclearization, very, very different from what President Donald Trump wants to hold himself out to believe in, for example. And eventually, I'm afraid one party or both parties may be disappointed because of the summit meeting. We hope nothing wrong will happen between today and the summit meeting in Singapore, and we hope no surprises in the negative term will come out from this summit meeting, and all the countries involved, including DPRK and the United States, will continue to work towards the final and ultimate goal of denuclearization and keeping peace and stability on the Korean Peninsula.
So, Paolo, that final and ultimate goal that Victor was talking about there was a report released by Stanford University which said that the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula could take up to a decade.
Oh, I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, yes, because again, it all depends what are the things. In other words, this is like a puzzle. You know, things have to kind of click together in order to get the whole picture. And what does Pyongyang want in return for giving up its precious asset? And that we don't exactly know. Is it indeed political recognition? Of course, guarantees. But how good are these guarantees? The fact that the United States said, oh, we'll never invade North Korea. Big deal. You say today, tomorrow, you know, it could be a different situation, and they can say, you know, extenuating circumstances, something happened. In other words, this is very, very complex. And of course, one thing which is the wild card here that we can only guess, which may influence the tempo of these negotiations, is how badly does North Korea need this? In other words, is North Korea in really dire straits when it comes to its fairly dreadful economy and general financial conditions, whereby it really needs oxygen, so to speak, to come from the West, from the United States, from South Korea, etc. And therefore, even if the price for this is to a relaxation of the, of the strategic stalemate that we have, that they're willing to go for it because they badly need aid? Or are they there and they can bluff their situation and say, well, we don't need anything, and we can perfectly ready to walk away with no deal if we don't get what we want? But be that as it may, instant coffee cannot be made in Singapore. There's no way that that's going to happen. And therefore, be ready for long negotiations. And again, not to be a pessimist, but let's not forget, we've been there before. We had different negotiations when the North Korean nuclear program was far less advanced than it is today. And they failed. And there was a lot of promise. Back even the Clinton administration and other attempts, deals were announced.
Okay, Sourabh, very quickly, I've got 10 seconds. Does the US need this more than The DPRK.
Oh, no, the DPRK needs this much more than the US. And we saw that from that cancellation, and the DPRK came running back. Let's put this on track. DPRK needs this more.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for being with us.
Thank you.
That's it for this edition of The Heat, but the conversation continues online. Join us on CGTN America's Facebook page to comment on this or any other show, or chat with us on Twitter at CGTN America. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.